Welcome everybody to Digital Tabletop Festival, and we are going to talk about the wonderful wide world of alcohol, beer, wine, spirits, all sorts of cheeky things. Because it's 5 o'clock somewhere. So if it's in the evening and you're watching this now, fantastic. If it's not, then maybe go easy. So my name is Peter, and I am the producer on Brewmaster, and I'm going to be I'm going to call myself a compere. Is that all right? Or a brewmaster, a tasting lead, something like that, sommelier. For this event, and I am joined by a wonderful cast of people, and we'll start with you, Elisa, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. My name is Elisa. I am business developer and co-founder at Broken Arms Games, a small indie video game studio based in Italy. We recently launched on PC and mobile a game called 100 Days, and it's a winemaking simulator game. I think that we will talk a little bit more of that later.
Absolutely, absolutely. Let's come to you next, Jamey.
Yeah, I'm Jamey Stegmaier. I'm joining you from St. Louis, and I run a company called Stonemaier Games, which we built our foundation on my first published game, Viticulture, a game about winemaking in Tuscany.
Hi, I'm Tysen Streib. I'm an indie freelance AI developer. I work for a couple different companies, but mostly with Digidiced, who makes digital versions of board games. And one of the board games we made was Viticulture, which is Jamey's game. So I helped design the AI opponents, the bots that you could play against in that game, as well as designing some of the logic and rules interactions for all the cards and stuff.
All right, I'm Kenny Gould. I'm the founder of a digital beer magazine called Hopculture. I am the creative director for a beer app called Untappd. I am on Instagram at HopCultureKen. I know very little about computers, but I love games. And if you want to know about beer, I'm your guy.
I'm Tom, marketing manager at Nomad Games, a tiny little indie studio based in the middle of the British countryside, and we specialize in digital board games.
Brilliant. So, well met, everyone. We're in the tavern. So the theme for this, for Digital Tabletop Fest, of course, is RPGs. And for this one, we thought, well, where better to start an adventure than in the tavern? I know whenever I've written an RPG, I've always set it there. That's how creative I get with my RPG running. So I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about alcohol, games, culture, how the whole thing mixes together. A little bit about how all of that stuff has been represented in the past, how it's kind of represented now, how things have kind of moved forward. Talk about your wonderful things as well. And then we'll get into a little bit more as well. We'll get into the weeds. So cool. I will start things off. I wanted to talk a little bit about how alcohol is represented, because I think I don't know about everybody here, but I think it is a slightly sensitive subject at times for people. It's certainly one of those things in the realm of video games, and I think in the realm of board games as well. I'm definitely going to need some help on this one. That it can feel a little bit like there's some sensitivities around that. So I'm going to start just from the video game side, because I know a little bit of that already, and some of the ways that these things have kicked off. From my research, I found that basically the first ever video game that featured alcohol was a game called Tapper by Midway, and it was actually sponsored by a little-known company called Anheuser-Busch. Plucky little upstarts that they are, they decided to make a video game with Midway, and it had the Budweiser motif in it. And then we didn't really get a lot of stuff from then on out. It was kind of that. It was then repurposed into Root Beer Tapper for more traditional arcades, because it was originally in pubs. Tapper itself was actually in pubs itself, and then not a lot else. And I'm kind of interested to know, like, when was the first game that all of you folks sort of saw alcohol in a game, or in a video game, or in a board game, or that kind of thing?
Let's start? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't recall exactly which video game actually was the first one. Definitely something kicked in when we saw the DLC from The Witcher that is all placed in this beautiful wine region, and I mean, to me personally, as a person that was born and still lives in the countryside of Italy, in Piedmont, in a winemaking region, was like, they are representing something that it's really close to me. Actually personally speaks to me a lot. So I don't think that was the first one probably that I encountered in the past, but probably was the one that made me think, okay, we can do something related to wine. I mean, I'm a huge wine lover, so it was the first time that I was like, okay, there is something there. We can do something. We can talk about wine culture. If they portray such a beautiful region with so much details also related to wine. I mean, they are CD Projekt, they are big guys, but as an indie studio, maybe we can do something about it. And I mean, our idea didn't start there, but like it was probably the first time that something started to ring in our head about wine and alcohol culture inside video games.
The first one that I can think of, because I can't think of many from too long ago, but when I was researching for Viticulture back in 2011, I did find a few wine-related tabletop games that already existed. There have been some beer making games and whiskey making games that have come since then, but before that, the only fairly big game was a game called Vinhos by not Vlad Chvátil. I'm going to blank on the name here, but Vinhos, which it was fairly well known then, and probably better well known now after a nicer second edition came out. But before that, I don't know if I can think of any tabletop games that really focused on wine or beer or alcohol.
Yeah, I mean, from my experience on the tabletop side, it hasn't been sort of a main feature. It's been sort of a side feature. So you could have you may have alcohol as a resource or something like that. It's typically like a wild resource. Like everybody loves beer, so anybody would be happy getting a beer. So you could use that for any resource you wanted. Yeah, on the video game side, I'm pretty sure I saw Tapper or Root Beer Tapper in an arcade when I was younger. No idea which one it was. And after that, probably some digital RPG that had featured alcohol somewhere.
Right.
I'd be hard pressed to tell you which one it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And Thomas, of course, in alcohol is a theme in Talisman, in that there's the pub, of course, that there's which is obviously very early on, a fairly early board game. But any others that you can think of there?
So I was just trying to think, because in Monopoly you get the different chance cards. And I was like, is there one that's related to alcohol in there? Like you get wasted and lose $50, but I can't remember if there actually is one. But yeah,
this British version of
the
Monopoly
earliest ones.
Different than the one we had, I think. I don't remember that card.
I seem to remember that as well. Yeah. It would be, you'd go and win a modelling competition, then you'd go and have a few beers afterwards or something. Yeah. And what about yourself, Kenny?
The earliest I can remember alcohol in a video game I was thinking it was when I was 12 or 13, and I looked it up, and it was the Elder Scrolls 3. Morrowind came out, one of my favorite games, and I think I remember you can find some type of alcohol in that game, and if you drink it, it made your vision really blurry, but it improved your strength stats. I think that it was the Elder Scrolls 3, so that was like 2002, 2003.
Right.
But it was, of course, just a small piece of the much larger game. If anybody watching actually has a lead on an original Tapper game, the journalist in me got really excited. I'd love to check that out. That's such a cool. I didn't know Budweiser sponsored an arcade game. That's so cool.
And I think it's really interesting that there aren't so many examples from back then, because I think board games and video games traditionally we kind of work in a medium that that has been traditionally seen as for children, certainly in that period of time, 70s, 80s, 90s. It was very much like family fun, right? Board games are family fun. You get Cluedo out on the weekend or in the caravan when it's raining. Equally, video games are kind of the same, and there were a lot of sensitivities around violence and alcohol and demonic possession and all that sort of nonsense that were going around at the time in video games. So I think that maybe alcohol was just kind of seen as a bit of a it was often seen as kind of a punchline, or certainly seen as something that was kind of ancillary. You would go to, a tavern in Final Fantasy, and you would have one too many colas in the Western version, and then you'd stagger about all that kind of stuff. Whereas now we're kind of moving into the very late aughts and into the tens now, and I think all of the games that we're working on now have certainly the adaptations have been modern, and they've kind of focused on elements of alcohol that are more interesting, I think, than just you stagger around and maybe sometimes you get strong, which I think is a fun idea, certainly. But it's one of those things of it's become more intrinsic with our culture. I want to focus a little bit on viticulture to begin with, just because I've got you two to really specifically about wine and board games here. So obviously this is about the creation of alcohol rather than actually kind of necessarily about consuming it. Can you give us a little bit of a rundown about, top level view of like how the game plays, and also a little bit about once we have kind of a good view on how that game plays and indeed how it came about, how that changed into a digital version, or how it was kind of done as a digital version?
Yeah, the core idea of the game of Viticulture, I would say it's an order of operations worker placement game, and by that I mean there are different steps for you to work towards filling a wine order. So you need to build certain buildings like a trellis so that you can plant vines, so that you can harvest grapes from those vines and then turn those grapes into wine and then sell that wine to someone who wants it. So you're kind of going through these steps in an order that is conducive to your strategy by placing workers on the board to do these various things. And one of the key features of the board of the game that we might hear more about from Tysen are the visitor cards. And that's the closest the game really gets to the consumption of alcohol. So there are, in my research for winemaking, I discovered that there's a lot more to the wine industry than just making wine itself. There's also the tourism aspect of it, bringing people to your vineyard and making money from those people. So that's where the visitor cards came from. And some of them have to do with the consumption of wine. But mostly, yeah, that's the core construct of the game right there.
Yeah, and on the digital side, we try to be as faithful as we can to the original board game. So there's not really additional features that you can necessarily get on the digital side, besides being able to play with people remotely that you couldn't obviously do with a real board game, or against AI opponents if you're by yourself. But yeah, I mean, as far as the depiction goes, it's pretty much the same as the physical board game. You've got those visitor cards that Jamey was talking about, and before when we were talking about like the sensitivity around alcohol and make sure it's portrayed in the right light, we're still pretty PC about everything. There isn't anything about drinking to excess or anything like that.
Right.
The closest you've got, I think, is, you might have a card that's called like Wine Enthusiast or something like that, where it's a guy laying down with a bottle in his hand.
Excellent.
That's about as close as you can get.
Yeah. Hopefully that's in air quotes. Yeah. So just on that then, talking about staying with the digital adaptation and talking about the Viticulture as a board game as well, physical board game as well. Wine often has a really community aspect to it. There's a real sense of, you get together with a couple of people and you share a bottle of wine, you have wine over dinner. It's a communal activity. Was that something that you actively thought about, Jamey, during the development of the board game itself? Was that, gathering people around a physical space? Was that something you actively thought about when you were researching this?
That was certainly part of it. Yeah, you're right. In fact, I've seen many, many photos of Viticulture being played where people have a nice cheese plate and a bottle of wine on the table as they're playing. And that I love to see that. A big part of it too in the original creation was the what I perceived to be the romanticized notion of being at a vineyard or a winery and even running it. There's kind of a running theme in board games of farming, which I think is a somewhat romanticized theme. I don't know if any of you have been farmers in your lives. I have never been.
No.
I like the idea of playing it in a board game because it's very puzzly. I love the optimization puzzle of running a farm, but I don't actually want to go and work on a farm. And I try to bring that same thing over to a vineyard. I think there's this romanticized notion of being at a vineyard, running a vineyard, choosing how to mix together these grapes and these wine, but I don't actually want to do that in real life. And so it provides like a safe space to do that. And I think there is a communal feel to that, as you alluded to.
Yeah. Cool. Let's talk about communal feel for a second. We'll swing on over to beer for a moment. We'll let the wine go down. So Tom, let's talk about Talisman. Let's talk about where this kind of comes in. Obviously, we've invited you on to talk about Talisman and talk about sort of 1980s. It's a 1980s board game. I think it was late 80s, wasn't it? That kind of thing.
Yeah, it was like 83, I think.
83. Were there any good board games back then? Surely. No, and absolutely Talisman is one of them. It's a fantastic game. It'd be great to hear a little bit about Talisman and a little bit about like some of the sort of themes in the game.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this before the panel, and I think obviously with it being so old, Talisman's a very like classical fantasy style board game. Like think very early Dungeons and Dragons. So I think a lot of the features of it hark back to that classic fantasy, and I think the tavern that's on the board is a really good example of that. Because if you think about classic fantasies, if you think about Dungeons and Dragons, where does every adventure begin? It begins at the tavern, because anything can happen in the tavern. Like it's a really open space for things to happen. So, for example, in Talisman, which is a classic roll and move style game, you arrive at the tavern and then you roll a 6-sided dice, and there's 6 opportunities. So they basically narrowed down what can happen in a tavern to 6 possibilities. So you can either get drunk,
Okay.
You can get tipsy and get into a fight. You can gamble and lose, or you can gamble and win.
Okay.
You can meet a wizard. I'm sure we've all been to taverns where we've met a wizard.
Yeah.
And then you can meet a boatman who'll just take you on a trip across a river.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, who hasn't been to a tavern and had one of those 6 things happen?
Absolutely. And I'll bring it over to you, Kenny, because obviously, obviously hop culture talks about the culture of beer, talks about the, what's going on in the world of craft and beyond, I'm sure. So you're fairly familiar with British pub culture, am I right?
I am. I actually studied in England for a little bit.
There we are. And there's something quite unique about pub culture, I think, in Britain. That is very much about what Tom was kind of saying. Maybe not with the wizards and the boats and so forth, but there is something very communal, very very leveling about a pub, which is that it's very. You walk into a local pub in England, and there's working class people, and there's there's rich folks sat in the corner. There's people from all walks of life who are meeting in this one communal element. What's craft beer culture like? Is it around the world? I know that's quite a big question, but like, is that generally the same across all like craft culture, or is that unique just to Britain?
That's a really interesting question. I would say that I think British pub culture is fairly unique, but I think each culture around the world has their own version of drinking culture, right? And even the products that are made, I mean, fermentation is something that will happen naturally if you leave out sweet water, just with the microbes that are floating around in the air. So, I mean, almost every culture around the world, you look at chicha in Central America, you look at Tej in Ethiopia. You look at beer culture in Europe. Every culture has their own sort of history of fermentation, and I think that similarly, every culture has their own drinking culture that has arisen out of these beverages. So, I know in the US it is very communal. I would say that probably most of the breweries I go to, there is less diversity, which I would love to see more of, and that's something that as an industry in the United States we're dealing with right now. It's very topical. But I would say that feeling of camaraderie and being able to go to a brewery and just meet, somebody and usually their dog too, because breweries have become great places for people to bring their pets. It's a very fun atmosphere. But I do think, at least the pubs I went to when I was in England, it is a really unique culture, and we have a version of it, but it's American beverage culture. Yeah.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, let's take the cork back out of the wine bottle for a moment. We'll go over to you, Elisa. So how does the game get across wine culture specifically in a video game form?
Good question. We tried our best to represent the culture that is around us, surrounding us as a studio, because we live in this winemaking area in Italy. We tried our best to replicate and represent the process, actually, the arts and craft that is related to making wine, because there is definitely a scientific side with fermentation and stuff, but there is a craft in terms of knowledge that are passed by families and people. So what we wanted to represent was this love for your territories, for the countryside in which we live, and in the game you inherit this lovely old winery with vineyards in Piedmont, in our area, in Langhe. And as a player, you will have to go through the whole learning process, because you don't know what to do with those vineyards, and you don't know how to make wine, and you will actually have all the different people, part of the community of your little small village, that will help you craft the art of winemaking, actually. We wanted to bring what we learned through families and friends and what we grew up with into the game. I'm not sure if we did it in the right way, but definitely a lot of players enjoyed. And what we see is that we have community on Discord actually talking about the fact that they want to visit Piemonte, or maybe they knew Tuscany through Viticulture. A lot of them, actually. And now they want to know another winemaking region. They want to taste different products. They want to understand the differences between region and terroirs and wine, and how they actually represent in the form of a bottle, because of course the only thing that is missing inside the game is tasting. So you can create different wine, and you can have an idea of the aromas and the flavors, but of course you can taste it. So yeah, that's what we did our best to replicate and represent. And we hope we did justice to our land.
Yeah. So I'm going to open this next question up to everybody, basically, and just want to kind of get a good smattering of answers from different places. One of the I want to know what it is that we find interesting about alcohol as a theme for a game, for a video game, for a board game, for writing about so that people can pay you to do that as a living. What is it about alcohol that actually, whether that's beer or wine or spirits or whatever it ends up being, what is it about that thing that we find so appealing? While I'll let you think about that question for 30 seconds, let me tell you about what I think it is. With Brewmaster, which is a first-person homebrewing simulation game. So it's you've got all of your equipment, you've got all of your ingredients, you pour all the different ingredients and waters together and all that sort of stuff, boil them, and you basically make homebrew. It's a first-person simulation game. With that, our interest in it was actually partly about kind of like the joy of science, the joy of learning of how something actually works. So there is I have a quite deep belief that one of the things that we are generally as human beings is very, very curious. We like to figure out how something works, right? So, I look at my mobile phone, I'm always just like, how is this all meant to actually be working? You can never figure it out because it's really, really complicated, right? But when you're looking at something like homebrew, you take some simple ingredients and some simple processes, you combine them in different ways, and you end up with very, very complex results afterwards. When you put hops in to a specific part of the brewing process, will define whether or not you get certain flavors out of those hops. And what those hops are, is very much down to their their physical makeup, their chemistry. And so we basically wanted to represent that by having a real simulation of beer brewing. We actually have a chemical simulation that runs underneath the hood constantly. So we were really interested in that, the idea of how do you craft something together. I'm going to come over to you first, Kenny, to kind of talk about what is it about beer that keeps you writing about it.
Oh, yeah, I think what you said really resonates with me. I mean, certainly you can make beer without hops. People did for hundreds of years, Gruit style ales. But mostly since the 1600s, we've had four main ingredients in beer, right? You got hops, barley or malt, yeast, and water. But you're right, with those four ingredients, there's infinite variation, as 9,000 breweries just in the US alone will tell you. That's so interesting, right? I think looking at something that is consumable and seeing just how something so simple can have so much variation is very interesting to me. But I think also, going back to what I said before, there's just this sort of universal element to fermentation and to alcohol. Cultures that never touched one another until fairly recently in human history, each had their own version of fermented beverage. So it's something that I think since really the agricultural revolution, for thousands and thousands of years, beverage culture has been a part of human story. So it's something that is very innate, at least to modern humanity. The concept of breaking bread with people, right? Beer is liquid bread. So it's something that has been a part of the human story for a very long time and has been used as ritual. It's been used as a social lubricant. It's been used to celebrate. Those are the things that I get excited about, really the stories behind the beer, the liquid.
What was it that kind of grabbed you and made you think, yes, I'm going to make something about alcohol?
I can say what was for us. I mean, it's definitely the craft. Actually, you said it right. Like, it's this combination of science from one side and craft from the other that actually we love about the winemaking process in general, and that it's really interesting because you start with very few ingredients. With wine, it's just grapes, yeast, and a little bit more, but and then you end up with so many different results. And what we actually really love, and we try to convey that also into the game, is that a specific piece of land and its geographic position, its soil, will create so many different great wine varieties out of it. And it's completely crazy because you think, okay, it's soil, it's the same, and it changes so much the end result that mind blowing to me. And actually, that's something that I really love to understand. Every time we drink a new wine, every time we taste something different, we want to know the process and what they did different from others, and how they end up with that specific flavor, with that taste that we love so much.
Was that the same for you, Jamey? Was it that?
In the end, it was, but initially, my answer isn't exactly to do with alcohol. The purpose of the game stemmed from rather what the theme wasn't. The theme wasn't a science fiction theme. It wasn't a fantasy theme, because a lot of the board games at the time, and they're really back in 2011, there were a lot of games, but not nearly as many as there are today, tabletop games. But a lot of them were science fiction and fantasy games. And I love those themes. We've mentioned a few games with those themes today. But specifically, I wanted to design a game that could appeal to potential gamers who hadn't entered the tabletop hobby because they weren't interested in science fiction or fantasy themes. So it wasn't so much about I guess in the end it was about the appeal of winemaking, or what I hope would be the appeal of winemaking, but it was really more that it just wasn't about wizards or fighting ogres or things like that. That was the original inception of the game.
Absolutely. Awesome. So what is it then that we, when we think about creating games around alcohol, one of the things I'm always really interested in figuring out is who actually we think that audience is. Like we're always thinking, whether it's making games, whether or not it's talking about it, if it's culture of it, writing about it, we always have to kind of think as makers of essentially commercial art, or some form of entertainment to actually be enjoyed. We have to think to ourselves, like, who is the audience for this? I think you raise a really good point here. So who is the audience? Like, who is the audience that is interested in wine and beer on the sort of level that we are that would be therefore interested in playing something or reading more about those things? Because again, from my side of things, before we started on Brewmaster, I think from my perspective, I kind of had this idea that, well, all beer is kind of the same, and it's all kind of a little bit lager louty, and it's all just whatever. And before getting into wine to some degree, I would have seen it as quite snobbish and very elitist and all that kind of thing. And I have to feel, I mean, personally, my views on that have changed pretty radically. But I'm really interested to find out, Tysen, for example, like, do you think that the audience for a digital version of running a vineyard, who is the audience for that? Who wants to play that kind of a game?
Well, I think it's mostly would be people who are interested in, the winemaking process. You get to learn a little bit about all the different steps that go into it, which you may not be familiar with before. You may not realize how complicated it can be, how many things you actually have to go through in order to go through the entire process, as well as the different aspects of running a vineyard that you may not normally think about. You got the tourism aspect. And one of the good things about the board game or the digital adaptation or video games in general is it could appeal to a younger audience as well, and get them interested in a side of alcohol that doesn't involve drinking, and get them educated about everything that goes into it, so that alcohol isn't just this mysterious thing that makes your vision blurry or something.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously, Kenny, this is your kind of bread and butter, knowing the audience that you have access to as part of Untappd and as part of Hop Culture. What is it about those that do you see a trend in any of your audiences? Are there can you generalize about the beer drinking audience?
Yeah, definitely. By the way, Jamey, your cat is
absolutely
me, man.
Amazing.
That is the cutest thing I've seen today. We have two different audiences really for Hop Culture and Untappd. Hop Culture is mostly US based. It's kind of millennial. younger. A lot of the art for the brand is behind me. Actually, British artist Sam Taylor does a lot of that. So it's very colorful and it's young and it's fun and it's sort of celebrating kind of what's new in beer within the last couple of years. Whereas Untappd has been around for a little bit longer, and the audience is definitely more global. Actually, about 50% of the check-ins that we get, if you don't know what Untappd is, it's an app that you can use free iPhone and Android to rate beers and keep track of the beers that you've tried and find new beers. Kind of like the Yelp. Do you have Yelp in England? Yeah, like the Yelp for beer. So our audience there it's huge, millions of active users a month, and about 50% of it coming from Europe. And we're starting to see as well some growth in South America and Asia, which is really cool. So, beer is sort of proliferating. I've always called it a very democratic beverage because it is generally cheaper to make than wine. It's generally cheaper to acquire than wine. And anyone can make it. You can crack some grain, you can put some hot water through it, let it sit out overnight on a cool evening, and sanitize. You can kickstart a fermentation process. So it's kind of like sourdough bread. Anybody can learn to do it. It's not that expensive to get into it. So we're seeing that global audience for beer drinkers, people interested in beer, expanding, which is really cool. And there is an overlap. Actually, there's within any group of millions of people, you're going to have sort of subsets of an audience, right? But gamers is one subset that we've seen, at least on the Untappd app. People really interested in gaming, and technology. So it's been pretty fun to see.
And let's talk with you, Tom and Jamey, about this. The obviously coming from a board game space, do you get is there a general kind of audience for board games? Is there a so? And I guess I would kind of limit this to, I'm not talking here about your massive Hasbro titles, the stuff that is the kind of the shelf stacking stuff in WH Smith's and other news agents are available, those kinds of places. I'm talking more about those kinds of the sorts of board games that do well on places like Board Game Geek and that kind of place. Your Talismans, your Viticultures, those kind of things. Is there a general kind of consensus as to what that audience looks like that wants to play those kinds of board games?
Actually, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, it's changing very rapidly, I'd say, because of the advent of things such as board game cafes, especially here in the UK. Those are raising at a very rapid pace. So I think that board games, in terms of the people that enjoy them, are expanding more rapidly than we can actually sit and go, okay, this is what the audience looks like, which is great because that means you've got such a wide range of people enjoying board games. But then I think you've also got to take into account that opens up all these different kinds of people that you've got to cater to. So, for example, you have board game cafes where they have a much more focus on serving alcoholic drinks, having the kind of games that people who are drinking would want to enjoy. So yeah, I think it's hard to say, oh, here's the one demographic, because they're getting so big at the moment.
Would you agree with that, Jamey?
I would, yeah. I think that's a great answer for 2021. Back in 2011, 2012, when I originally funded Viticulture and Kickstarter, I sent out a survey after the project and did some phone calls to vineyards and wineries during the project, because originally I was hoping to sell. I was expecting to sell maybe about 50% of the games to gamers and 50% to wine lovers who weren't yet gamers. And as it turned out, I was very wrong about that second category. by far the biggest category of people who bought into viticulture were gamers who happened to like wine, not wine lovers who were intrigued by games. That was a very small percentage, and we had very few vineyards or wineries that were interested in the game, which makes sense. You go into a vineyard or a winery, you're probably going there to buy wine or drink wine, not buy a $60 game about making wine. And I think that is a very small data set from a small project years ago. But I think Tom is absolutely right about board game cafes and how that has increased the appeal of games to a broader audience, probably better than a single game like Viticulture has.
And just to mirror what you folks were saying there, I think that there's been it's really interesting to see the kind of rise of sort of the mid-90s, seeing board games really starting to mature. You start to see Catan and your Carcassonnes, and like you start to see those board games start to actually get into kind of like the public zeitgeist globally, and then people saying, oh, okay, it's not just Mousetrap. It's, there's some really interesting other games over here doing these different things. It's really interesting to see that, and also see where craft beer came from, because obviously with alcohol across wine and beer, wine has always had this. It seems to have always had this kind of. It's always done okay. It's always done really well. Lots of people really like wine, and it continues to go on. And I feel like more recently there's been some wineries, certainly out in Australia, that have tried to kind of crack into kind of like Western markets with wine that is a little bit less. What's the right word? A little bit. The barrier to entry to wine is lowered a little bit by some of those vineyards, by saying like, look, it tastes like this, like this, like this, and they're flavors that what they taste like, right? And I think that in the sort of like it was around the 80s, I think, Kenny, where basically US craft culture really started to pick up after homebrewing kind of was made legal again, and then we end up with critics like Michael Jackson, for example, really popularizing Belgian beers. Is there what do you think it is about movements in general? So whether that be, something like board games or video games maturing, or a specific form of, beverage or something like that. What is it about those things? What do we actually need for those things to become mature or change from something that is either seen as kind of quite limiting, i.e., it's a kids game that you play on a wet weekend in Solihull, or it's only Foster's beer and that's everything that exists? What is it that actually kind of sparks that change of people becoming more interested in those things?
That's the best question I've been asked in the last week. That's a big one. I can give you my 2 cents.
Sure.
What's first coming to mind for me, so I've never been a big board gamer, and in the last year, I started a D&D campaign.
Nice.
I bought Pandemic, which was a terrible time to buy the game Pandemic. Too soon. I played a couple card games. There's a German card game I've been playing called Bonanza, which is awesome. I played a Disney board game, which was super cool. Got into Catan. So in the last year, I've really been converted, and I think it was just a word of mouth thing. I think there's a momentum that gathers where, games are fun. They're games, right? And whereas maybe a year ago, I might not have been, it just might not have been on my radar. I had a friend that really brought me into it and said, oh, you're coming over. This is what we're doing. It's going to be a blast. And I think the same thing kind of happened in beer, really in sort of the late 90s. And then within the last couple years, even, there was sort of another wave with a lot of breweries making IPAs, and the rise from 2,000 breweries in the United States in 2012 to almost 9,000 independent craft breweries in the United States today, only 9 years later.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's just that people caught on to how fun it was. The idea of running a brewery as a business owner seems fun. At least to me. That sounds like kind of a cool lifestyle. And I think the idea of going to a brewery, hanging out with my friends, spending time in a really pretty place, drinking, consuming really fun things like that. That sounds fun. So I think there's like a momentum that catches on when enough people are like, oh, this is a really cool way to spend some time. And I think, at least in the last year or two, I've seen more of my friends who had no idea what a board game was or a card game was get more into that than ever. So my hope is that that momentum continues because it is fun and it is a very social thing. I'd be interested in knowing, in places like Italy, have you seen the same adoption? Are people like getting into games within the last year, or the general public in the way that they are seemingly in the US?
Definitely. The pandemic, of course, the fact that even, I mean, board game, but also a lot of role-playing game done through Discord or through Skype, because you cannot reach out, you cannot meet friends in person. So yeah, definitely. And it was definitely a word of mouth thing. Nothing major, like in terms of advertising or other stuff. It's just like, we cannot meet in person. Let's play something together. Let's have a role-playing session on Discord. Yeah, almost the same effort. And it's really nice because like we had also a lot of older people getting back to playing, and that's a trend that we saw also with 100 Days. Like, we had people that played games in the past and love board games or love role-playing games, and then because they are forced at home, they discover again that hidden passion, something that they cannot like keep working on because of families and kids and stuff. And we saw a lot of that in the last year and a half. And it's a different demographic that probably, even for the digital world, was a little bit missing somehow, or hidden somewhere. And it was a really nice demographic spread out a lot.
Tysen, have you found that with digital board games? Anecdotally, digital board games have kind of seems to have increased. Basically, yeah, seeing some nods from you as well, Tom. Like Tom and Tysen, like, do you see that digital board games have become were kind of a replacement at one point, or kind of increased in their the appeal of them over things like the pandemic or times we just can't get together?
Yeah, the pandemic definitely pushed digital board gaming into a bigger light than it was before. For me, I've always loved digital board games for years, just because it's a lot easier to play with friends or random strangers at 5 minutes a time.
Sure.
When I've got a break here and there. Rather than trying to organize some game night and get friends to come over and do everything like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but there are, before the pandemic, lots of people would never touch digital board games because for them, board games are all about, the social aspect and being together with friends face to face and so forth. The pandemic sort of opened a lot of doors there, getting people to try digital board games for the first time. People who would have never would have tried it before. And I have seen, on message boards and stuff like that, people saying, I would have never tried this before, and now I'm totally in love with digital board gaming. So, it took something as horrible as the pandemic to spark that. But I think we're definitely seeing a surge in the digital board gaming side because of that.
Absolutely. Like the number of people that I've had either seen comments or reached out directly where they're like, look, we used to have monthly talisman nights and we've had them for years, and suddenly we can't do them anymore. And because there's the digital version, they can still do it. Like, it's still happening, and they really appreciate not having to stop doing that, because I think it is that social aspect of it. I think you can still get that as like, we're all hanging out, this is something to do while we're hanging out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Obviously, we're joined by a very special guest, Jamey's cat. What's the name of the cat, Jamey?
This is Biddy. Walter is the really fluffy one that you saw earlier.
Biddy and Walter, excellent stuff. We'll get their views on making games and alcohol and craft culture later. But so one of the things I wanted to kind of touch upon is how we've obviously talked about alcohol affecting video games or board games or culture, right? So we've talked about that way of things being affected. But how do we see alcohol now being affected by wider culture? So Jamey, you talked a little bit about wanting to make a board game that was about something that wasn't about dragons and dungeons and laser beams, and that to me feels a little bit like board games going, right then, alcohol, it's your turn next. Like we're gonna start moving things forward and kind of changing those things up. Kenny, I think you and I have talked a little bit before about some of the fantastic art, for example, that's in the background there. Like that kind of art is not a traditional on beer labels and that kind of thing. It's been craft beer culture has been affected by things like skate culture and by sort of like psychedelic art and those kinds of things. So I guess I kind of wanted to open it up generally and talk about how are the things that we're making, the things that we're creating, how are they now affecting alcohol? It's a big
I think
one.
Kenny is going to know by far the most about this, but I'll throw out one little idea. And I don't know if there's a connection to board games, but there is a connection maybe to accessibility. I've seen this rise of hard seltzers, at least in the US over the last year.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of that might be tied to accessibility. One of you mentioned earlier the idea of Australian wines and specifying flavors that people can identify with. And I think hard seltzers did a pretty good job with that. It's almost advertising it as juice, almost like alcoholic juice. Kenny, you probably know way more about that, but have you seen that accessibility? Why are those seltzers taking off?
It's super interesting. I actually this morning was working on some new badges. The Untappd app is gamified, so if you check in, certain beers that meet a certain trigger criteria, you get like a badge or like a little medal. And I'm I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but you'll hear it first. We're working on one of the badges I was working on was a hard seltzer badge, just because it is become such a thing people are interested in. I think accessibility is could be one of the reasons. I ask myself this question a lot about hard seltzer in particular. I think we see these sort of pendulum shifts in the industry where for a while, 2017, 2018, 2019, you had this big shift toward like just being smashed over the head with flavor. And so you had these, in the United States at least, in the beer community, 14% stouts flavored like s'mores or donuts, or maybe there were even donuts in the beer, or you had these fruit bombs that were just, you turn them over and they drip out because they're so filled with fruit puree. And I think the tastes shift. I think people are still really interested in IPAs and that sort of thing, but the very clean, clear, single note seltzers, especially in the summer when it's pretty hot. That's when I saw them really pop off, was last summer. It's just fun, and you can drink a couple of them. You can not feel like you got kicked in the teeth by a horse the next day, and they're easy and clean and clear. So it could just be a pendulum shift. No, I was just thinking about your question and the way games have impacted alcohol. Yeah.
So one of the things I think, just kind of, because I know we're running out of time, so I'll start to wrap some of this up in a moment. But just to kind of dovetail some of that stuff, one of the things I found recently during the research was that actually now we're starting to see branded beers, branded on video games, branded on board games, having cafes that are very much about, as Tom, as you were saying, about matching those two things together, which I found fantastic. A little bit of research here. There is an Assassin's Creed wine.
Yeah.
When you're talking to Ubisoft about that, Jamey, you're going to check that thing. But I find that stuff really fascinating. That there does seem to be this kind of mix between those two things. So we're coming to the end of this. I'm upset. You're upset. The cats are upset. But one of the things that we'll do now is what I will do is I'll get you to kind of talk a little bit about obviously a reminder of where people can find the various things that everybody works on. So I'll kick things off. So Brewmaster is currently available to wishlist on Steam. Do please go and hit that wishlist button, then go and hit that follow button afterwards. It's really important that you do both of those things. We also have a newsletter. Sign up for that because we are going to do something pretty fancy for people on the newsletter very, very soon. Where can people find stuff for you, Elisa?
Daisy is on Steam and pretty much each and every one PC online digital store. We should be on mobile. I mean, when this airs, we will be on mobile. And we are coming soon, fingers crossed, on console. So, and if you happen to be interested in the game, just jump on our Discord server. And there is a lot of cyber vignerones, we call them. Really into wine, and we can share every Friday what we drink. So
fantastic, sounds good. Kenny, what about yourself?
This is me and Squishy. You can find us on Instagram at HopCultureKen. HopCulture is HopCulture Mag, and then Untappd is just at Untappd, UNTAPPD. The app is free, iPhone, iOS and Android store. HopCulture magazine, free digital magazine, hopculture.com, and we have a newsletter that goes out weekly. Trying to think what else. We have a very cool supporter program. We are, another spoiler alert here, but we're adding a ton of new features starting November 1st, and if you sign up between November and December, or you're already in it, you're going to be grandfathered in at the OG price for some really, really cool new features. So looking for a holiday gift or something, that's something to check out. I think that's me.
Fantastic. Tom?
Yes. So if you search for Nomad Games, you'll find all the stuff that we do. It's the easiest way of doing it. There is a World Nomad Games, which is like an Olympics thing for ancient sports. That's not us. Just Nomad Games.
Just Nomad Games.
Yeah. Search for us. You can find all the cool stuff we do. We do a monthly mailbag that we've just started where people can send in questions and about anything, digital board games, game development, and we'll answer them. So that's a really good way to interact with us.
That's great. Tysen?
Yeah, so you can find a lot of the digital games that I've helped develop on Digidiced. Do a search for Digidiced. We're on Steam. We're also on mobile, iOS and Android. We have a few titles on Switch, but not our complete library. We have a Discord that is just kicking off, so we'd love to get more people there talking about digital board games as well.
Fantastic. And Jamey?
The hub for everything Stonemaier Games related is stonemeiergames.com. You can find Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and specifically if you're interested in viticulture, we have Facebook groups for each of our games, including a Viticulture and Tuscany Facebook group.
That's absolutely fantastic. Well, all that remains is for me to say thank you ever so much for joining us in the tavern. And I'm sure we'll go on other adventures later on down the line. But yes, thank you ever so much. And thank you to you for watching.